the reality that she's facing is just beyond her comprehension. Like this is your brain on drugs. It's like for her, this is your brain on trauma. And he is unrelenting. Hello and welcome. This is PJ of Prey vs. Predator podcast, and I'm so happy to have you here tuning into this episode. Today I'll be discussing the third episode of the Netflix documentary Bad Vegan. It's my hope when you're done listening to this series that you're better equipped to identify and accurately label predatory behaviors. Predators use prey's trusting nature and ignorance of abuse tactics to gain power and control over them. I invite you to use this series as a guide to deepen your awareness and language for these techniques. Armed with this knowledge, we may begin to protect ourselves and the people we love from predators who hunt them. So the title of this episode is No Angels in Hell, which is interesting. And I'm curious if this is an attempt to sort of shade Sarma's good reputation and portray her sort of perhaps not as good as she appears. In reality, what we're going to see in this episode 3 is a fuller picture of MF's impact on Sarma and how he ultimately ruins and obliterates her life. We really start to see how he's gained almost complete coercive control over her at this point. So if you're turning into this episode for the first time, I invite you to go back and watch the entirety of the Bad Vegan Netflix series first, then come back and listen to the earlier 2 episodes of our breakdown of each of those episodes. That way you will be more familiar with some of the short forms and lingos that we're using in these episodes here. The episode opens with Nazim, who is Emma's friend and coworker, and he starts to talk about MF's gambling problem. Nazim starts to see cracks in MF's story, but since he has invested $100,000 into what he thought was pure food and wine, he says in the documentary, "If I walk away now, I wouldn't get anything." So that creates this situation for him where he decides that the least risk for him is to stay with MF and not risk losing it all, even though he has a really good sense that MF is not who he appears to be. A little bit later, we find out that Nazim finds out that MF has a wife, an ex-wife, and we have some incredibly similar parallels to Sarma's story. So his first wife notes that Anthony, MF, he got his father to lie for him. The ex-wife only knows this now in hindsight, but didn't know it at the time. And that's also what happened for Sarma. So we see this as a pattern. And he love-bombed. She doesn't use this language. You get the sense that she's not even quite sure what happened to her. And they get married just a few months into their relationship. He lived and spoke to her in this complete fantasy world where he was going to get a massive inheritance and he was setting up accounts. So then he talks about how they are reincarnated lovers, keep finding each other. Things start taking a turn for the worst, according to the ex-wife, when this fantasy inheritance doesn't come through. The wife is now pregnant and none of what he promised has been happening. And not long after she gives birth to their son, MF says to her, "You know you can kill a baby by giving them salt and it doesn't show up in an autopsy." The phrase I use for this type of thing is evil genius. You can't pin them down. He doesn't say he's going to kill his baby. He doesn't even suggest he's going to kill a baby. In fact, if you tried to pin anything on him, he would say, "He just read an interesting fact. Huh, weird." His ex-wife picks up very astutely that he's a danger potentially to their kids. But I'm going to imagine that for her, she was probably wondering if she was crazy. It's not like he would do that. I don't want to leave my baby alone in case he would. Certainly, if she tried to call him out on it, he would be very, very likely to then start saying how crazy she was. How would you ever say something like that? That's disgusting. I can't believe you think that. And this is a technique where they flip the predator victim role. We call it PVR. And this is a great example of that. So One thing I want to point out here is because they had no money, because she had a baby, and because she needed him, he ended up just leaving her. So one of the things that predators look for in somebody is somebody who doesn't need them. So this is likely why he ended up leaving. They don't do well when they're needed. They do well when they need. So this portion of the episode ends with MF's ex-wife essentially saying he left, and I figure he just left and went to find another me. This episode cuts to Sarma. We see Sarma saying that she felt like she had one foot in his reality and one foot in her reality. And then she says his reality would always win. So I find this quite fascinating because you're sort of bringing a knife to a gunfight, so to speak. So Sarma's trying to use reality to come up against him, and he doesn't have that constriction. He's able to use fantasy. And she doesn't realize in the moment that it's fantasy, but certainly that's what he's using.
He sent me to Rome by myself.
The episode continues watching MF sending Sarma to Rome. And he does this telling her that she needs to complete a test. And he says the family doesn't think she's strong enough, and that if she completes the test, then she will get all the things that he's promised her: immortality, riches, and of course her dog not dying. And while she's in Rome, her employees, her family, everybody becomes more and more confused with Sarma's behavior. Some of the things that they note is she was normally great at getting back right away, getting back to people on text. And it's interesting that everybody was really uncomfortable with that. So at some point while Sarma's in Rome, MF behind her back calls a meeting with her employees. In the meeting, he uses this amazing rhetoric. Somebody asks a question and they say, so are you in charge now? And he says yes and no. He just says, I want you to be happy, and then you'll be rewarded tenfold. And he uses all these phrases which suggest something, but you don't quite know what. What does rewarded tenfold mean? What does yes and no mean? He's saying words, it's just the words don't actually have anything to pin down. No one can ever say, you said this, because nothing actually was done or said. Now, while Sarma's in Rome, MF is not only trying to take over her business and do these meetings behind her back, but then he also asks her to give him more money. He asks for her to give him $100,000. What I find so fascinating at this point is she is incredibly responsible. She does give MF the money, and she realizes there's not enough money for payroll, and she panics and starts to work toward getting new investors to give her money to pay off the payroll. So in essence, what this suggests to me is that it is easier for somebody to raise $100,000 from investors than it is to say no to her husband. Anybody who deals with trauma or knows anything about their body's response to trauma, your body doesn't have a lot of options when you're traumatized. Most people out there have probably heard of flight, fight, or freeze. And there is another one, fawn or please and appease. So one is you fight, which we do see her do from time to time. Another one is freeze, where she gets quite frozen. Flight, we don't see any flight per se. And so we just start seeing, and this is sort of the beginning where we really start seeing her please and appease and freeze response to the trauma that she's under. One interesting part here is where it occurs to Sarma as she's speaking to the Netflix producers. She realizes now that MF had an obsession with Chris Hemsworth, who played Thor. And all this kind of talk about going to Rome and the test that she had to perform. There was this interconnection with his powerful brother and how he and this powerful brother were sort of at odds, even though they were brothers. And later she realized this was really mimicking the Thor movie and the themes from this movie. Now, as she reflects, is realizing how deep of a fantasy world this individual lived in. And predators have to live in fantasy because that is the only way they can buffer themselves from who they actually are: unloving, unkind, cruel. And so they buffer themselves with this world of fantasy.
There was one time I could tell that Sarma was not okay.
Sarma's sister is getting really worried about her. She's noticing deep changes in the behavior of her sister, and she wants to reach out to Sarma, and Shane essentially won't let her talk to her sister. The only language she has is, "This is weird. It's not like my sister." So the other thing that's interesting here is how MF is beginning to form groups. And one of the things that predators often do, especially when they are in need of more power, is to form allegiances and different groups with different people. So the father and the sister are getting one set of messages, and he alludes to the fact that Sarma maybe isn't well and that he really wants them to help him help her. Then to the people at work, he's trying to present another image and give them a different message. And so you've got these different groups where he's giving different messages about who Sarma is, what she's going through, and what his role might be in helping support her. This is a great technique because you don't know as prey what group is being told what, but the predator kind of has to do a pretty good job of keeping the groups separated as well. One of the things he does with his sister is he says he wants to arrange for Sarma to get help and that he needs family support. And this is a great example of gaslighting because he's actually separating them from her while he's telling them all he wants is to help her get support from them. This is his way of creating a barrier between her and her family. So at one point, Shane reaches out for more than just emotional support from Sarma's family. He asks the dad for money, and he asks the sister for money. I just give a shout out to these two people because they don't buy it. They are willing to risk losing him and Sarma rather than betray their own boundaries. It would be normal and natural for most of us to want to kind of betray our own senses. Well, I feel like there's something off about this guy. I don't want to risk my sister really being in trouble and me not being there for them. I better give him what he wants. Holding your boundary, even when things feel like they're at risk, is so important. And we see that the father and the sister did a fantastic job of doing this. And so then MF, he goes to the mother, and the mother is very much prey. And so he finds his sweet spot with the mom, and he uses these predatory behaviors with her because she does believe that her daughter is at risk. And so she bought into his fantasy world as well.
There were people you could reach out to.
I mean, how would I explain it?
So we do see that people did try to talk to her and say something to her and ask questions. The challenge is, she says, like, how would she explain it? What was there that she could say? I've given my husband $1.5 million, and if I just hold on a little longer and do these fantasy tests, I will get not just that money back, but so much money, and everybody will get paid back, and everything will be okay. And now we see Sarma getting caught up in this idea of fantasy herself. The reality that she's facing is just beyond her comprehension. Her husband is screwing her over everywhere behind her back while he is feeding her a fantasy world. And for most prey, it's not because they're stupid. It's not because they're ignorant. Their brains are not able to imagine somebody that they love and care about would ever be able to do this to them. She's living in this state because her husband was telling her everything would be okay. She was just so close. And this kind of carrot in front of the horse, you see this all through all 4 episodes, It's just right in front of you, just a little bit further. Any of you who've seen the Anna Delvey story, which we might do next, we see her doing this as well. We see her suggesting just a couple more days, you'll get paid. A couple more days. The wire transfer hasn't gone through. One more day. So this kind of carrot in front of the horse technique is used on Sarma for the entire time. So we're going to keep going because I want to highlight this phone call that we hear between Sarma and MF. And he essentially is saying to her, whatever happens, just go with it.
Are you going to send it, yes or no?
I gave you 1.5, more than that, $1 million.
What does that mean?
You think you can fucking scare me?
I'm not trying to scare you. It's not a threat. So now you won't even do that. Who are you?
And we see Sarma in the fight mode. She's like, I gave you 1.5, more than that. And he responds, what does that mean? And she says, do you think you can fucking scare me? And he's like, I'm not trying to scare you. It's not a threat. She's like, it's not happening. She's got the energy, and fight is a really good sign. Anybody who's listened to the podcast will know that we at Prey vs. Predator, we really like when sort of that anger comes up because it gives you the strength you need to have a voice. The challenge, and this is what's really important about this conversation, is what he does next when she digs in and stands up for herself. He starts to get quite loud, and then he just screams like, who are you? What have you become? The predator is using disgust, contempt, rage. Those are probably the most powerfully destructive elements that you can bring to a relationship. And he uses all of them in one moment. And then he continues to scream, who the fuck are you? And where's my fucking wife? You can hear the rage in his voice. So for a trauma victim, when somebody starts to get aggressive, especially the person who has traumatized you, which in this case is clearly MF, she's going to go into a deeper mode of trauma response, which for her is please and appease, or that freeze mode. Then he gives her two options. He says, stay in the dark or just trust him and go to Paris and finish this. So if you want this anger to go down, you do what I say. And then we see she does what he says. This is not her going along with him. This is coercive control. This is a traumatized victim obeying like a slave would obey their master, because if they don't, they will get so crushed. This is a great example of not just coercive control, but I think of a trauma response. And so we see her go along with it. There's a huge moment in the series where Pure Food and Wine shuts down as a result of Sarma's going to Paris, as a result of her having no money to pay her workers. The staff who have been, up till this point, had this deep, deep trust in Sarma and a deep loyalty to her, and they're not getting paid, and so they walk out. So we see this conversation. The documentary shows one of her workers, Joey, and he's on a phone call with her, and he notes that she just didn't sound like herself anymore. She's trying to get him to stay, and there's a conversation about money, and she accuses him of it being all about money. And this is somebody that has for a decade been with her, been loyal to her, really believed in her vision and who she was as a person. So for him, he's really discussing how heartbreaking this whole experience was for him, and he didn't know who she was anymore. I think what happens for many trauma victims is they become vicarious abusers. So we see her being abusive and aggressive and really out of character. But I think what happens is she has no language for what's happening to her. She has no ability to be herself, and everything's falling apart, and she has no ability to explain how or why. So when somebody who comes up, who she has a relationship with, a normal, healthy person, she's bumping up against that with her own anger and her own rage and all this pain that she's held in. And now she's attacking him in sort of a similar way that she's been attacked. Where I see this a lot in sort of real, not that this wasn't real life, but in more everyday situations, is I see parents whose partner is a predator. I see those parents sometimes go after their kids. And in some ways, they're trying to buffer their kids from abuse from the predator, but in some ways they're trying to buffer themselves from abuse of the predator. Like, look at me, I'm being really hard on this person. Look at me, I'm really calling the shots. So we don't know whether MF was listening in on this phone call. We don't have any of that information, but I wouldn't surprise me if he was. And part of her being a vicarious abuser is that she's in this space where if she doesn't, her trauma is escalated, and her abuse gets escalated. So we're going to skip a little ahead, and we do see this one moment that I wanted to highlight where Sarma is explaining how she wants to get herself off the bank accounts, because if she didn't have access to her own bank accounts, then MF couldn't take any more money from her. When MF finds out that she was doing this, he's absolutely enraged. We see at this point a few emails between Sarma and MF, and he says things like, "I warned you," and he's very upset that she did this. And she notes that he was always criticizing her for making the wrong move, doing something wrong. Everything out of her mouth is criticized. So she never gets a sense that she has any value to add to anything. He says at one point, "I'm not calling you a coward. I'm asking if you are one." So there's more gaslighting, more behavior meant to make her feel crazy, incompetent, inept. And she finds out that MF is using her email to talk to investors. And again, she tries to put a stop to that. And we hear another threat. And we hear him say things like, "You shouldn't have changed your password. It upset everybody." You can really hear anger and rage and hostility toward her. And these are behaviors that are designed to create fear in the person. So when you're in a state of being criticized and afraid, it's this trauma response that we see again and again and again. And we're seeing as this trauma escalates, we're seeing her behavior also start shifting. She becomes less of herself. Like, this is your brain on drugs. It's like, for her, this is your brain on trauma. And he is unrelenting. It is interesting because, even things like she'll say, "I've done everything you said." There's a bit of fight, but also this sort of desperation. Like, "I've done everything you said. Like, what else do you want from me?" She doesn't say that, but that's the energy. And he responds with this very cruel, almost everything. There is no give. There is no kindness. There is no grace. His compassion is zero. And we start to see that she has some suspicions. She's trying to piece things together. One of her things she's suspect about is, does Will exist? Will being the IT guy. And she says, it's funny, I called him out on a bunch of things and I was right. It's just that when you are in a mode of trauma, what you think is right, you don't trust. And again, anybody who's listened to Prey vs. Predator podcast will be very, very well versed in this technique. So we find out, and as she finds out, there's no Will. She was right.
It got to the point where I was calling him out for Will being bullshit.
He just read her emails. So all this time, she had thought and believed that he had access, that he could read minds, that he had all this power to know what she was doing and how she was doing it. So a little bit later, she says she wasn't allowed to get mad. So these are more mind control, sort of this coercive control techniques. When you get upset, when you have a natural, healthy response to abuse, he criticizes her for them. And again, more gaslighting, more traumatizing, more crushing of your sense of self and ability to trust your own emotions. We see at one point in her journal, it's only seen if you pause the screen for a moment, but one of the phrases she uses in her journal is, "Please make the bad feelings and the stress go away." So we see her at her most vulnerable point, begging for this to be gone. He keeps promising just one more step and it will be gone. Just one more day, one more moment, one more obedience, one more check, one more, and all of this will go away. And she's in a complete state of helplessness. And there is no way out for her at this point.
Get something else in your head, or somebody twist you around, or...
So we're going to skip to this conversation where Sarma is talking with MF. He's trying to be very soft and gentle. He's just saying, he's kind of worried because he doesn't want anybody twisting her or getting into kind of, I think probably to change her mind, that idea. And she says to him, the only one twisting me around is you. And he responds, you're right, on purpose, and admitting it. At this point, nothing she says has been right. Nothing she has done has been right for him. So he disarms her by agreeing with her. And then if you notice, she kind of calms down a little bit. And he starts in with what worries me. And then he gets angry, he gets loud, he gets intense, and he starts to attack her.
You signed on to this. You told me you love me.
This is where he does the PVR. He starts flipping the energies as if she's the predator and he's the victim. You're the one who signed on to it, not me. You're the one who told me you loved me. You're the one who wanted happily ever after. So this is all her doing. This is all her fault. The cortisol and adrenaline levels in somebody's body when somebody's doing this to them are so intense. You cannot think straight. Your entire body gets flooded with these kind of stress hormones, and your ability to kind of use your prefrontal cortex just goes completely offline.
You can choose to believe me.
So we're going to skip a little bit to segments of her journal. She talks a little bit about how do I explain this? It's a different story for different people. I'm playing a role. None of it's real. You can see her kind of desperately trying to put words to what's going on. In my experience, there's no way, while she's actively being traumatized, there would be no way for her to get the words unless somebody was there with her, kind of helping her see these things and put a vocabulary to it. So a little bit later, we discover that MF has given himself a new identity of Michael Caledonian, and he decides to come up with a plan to get more money from one of the investors, Jeffrey Chotero. And she sets up a meeting between the investor and this Michael Caledonian, who is just MF, in order to get more money. So she looks like she's actively participating, and she is, in reality, participating in the deception of her friend, Jeffrey Chotero, somebody who very much had supported her and been there for her and had taken a huge risk on her. And you can sort of see her own confusion. And she's like, well, what was I going to say? And then they ask her, did you feel bad lying? The only thing she says in response is like, I thought everyone was going to get their money back. So you can see how, again, she becomes another situation where she's a vicarious abuser. She's lying to somebody she cares about in order to placate her predator. And in the back of her mind, she's justifying it with this belief, this is the last step that I need to do in order for everything to go back the way it was, but be way better. So you can sort of see how split she is on this. And again, you can also see if you watch the show, she doesn't have a language for how to explain all this. Well, how would you? You see her meet Jeffrey in Miami, and MF sends her back to Connecticut, and they don't go there for a very long time. But then Sarma says, the craziness escalated to a point that I just shut down, and that was the strangest and most terrifying time. Him just driving away everything. I kind of knew everything was over at that point. Again, helplessness, but we're going to start seeing that the freeze starts to take over.
I mean, I don't really know what we were doing. Certainly didn't have the perception that we were on the run.
Sarma's life as she knew it has been completely decimated. She's cut off from her friends. She's cut off from her coworkers. She's cut off from her family. The only way her family can access her, so they think, is through MF. Her business has been destroyed. Her formerly loyal, loving employees now are angry, hurt, devastated. She's been lied to. Everything she has done and said has been monitored by MF. She is completely and utterly trapped. We're starting to get little snippets of responses like she should have known better. And with nothing left, MF decides to concoct a plan where they start to travel relentlessly around the country. And she says, I didn't know what we were doing, but I certainly didn't have the perception we were on the run. So the police are looking for her at this point. She's in big trouble and she can't explain a lot of what happened for her. And that to me is just so devastating as somebody who, you know, all of us at Prey versus Predator have gone through this type of thing where nobody understood and nobody believed us. Nobody really had an idea. And so watching somebody else go through this and then having somebody else capitalize on her pain, just think that is re-victimization of the victim. I guess I think there was no chance for her to have enough space and time and maybe therapy to get the language she needs to explain actually what happened. And then they use that to create a different narrative than is accurate. So thanks for being with me on this, you guys. It's such a joy to have people listening and get the feedback that we've gotten. And I hope that this has been very meaningful and powerful. So thanks for joining me.